We can't get caught riding double on a stolen bike after all we've been through.
Oh, yeah?
Okay, so I do have to fess up for a moment. When I concluded the last installment of this series with the remark that Kyoto Animation was going to put the pedal to the metal, I wasn't actually planning to have the opening clip for this video be such a literal take on that line. But hey, sometimes the planets align and you stumble into something cool. Welcome everyone to the newest installment of Finding Kyoto Animation. Today we'll be taking a look at what happens when the studio steps into the realms of their own television productions and decides that the best way to do so is to let lunacy rule the roost and have everything firing on all cylinders, Full Metal Panic Fumoffu. Or, if you want to treat the punctuation more seriously, Full Metal Panic Fumoffu. As stated in previous video installments in this series, Kyoto Animation had established themselves as being a studio trusted with outsourcing work on projects from numerous companies from the 80s through the early 2000s. From the responsibilities given to them by larger studios such as Tatsunoko Productions and Sunrise with Inuyasha, there could be no question any further as to Kyoto Animation's capabilities as a studio working in the field. The forays into their own work with Nurse Witch Komugi in 2002, based on Shimbo Akiyuki's The Soul Taker, and Kigami Yoshiji's original production Munto in the spring of 2003, had also demonstrated that they were willing to branch out into other directions, and possibly even create their own series. With the mentorship and willing students at the recently opened Kyoto Animation School, and their limited company Animation Do, there was never a better time for the creative juices to flow within the building's walls. So, spurned by the success they had been receiving up until this point, Hata Hideaki and Yoko, the company's then president and vice president, and all those in the studio's executive branch, made a collective decision. It was time to finally strike it on their own. Outsourcing work would still be a part of what the studio would do, but they'd make their presence known in a new way. It was time to make their own seasonal TV anime. But in the wake of wanting to do that, there's several problems that come with this. To begin with, which approach should be taken? Especially considering that this would be the studio's first impression for new anime fans who may not necessarily be aware of Kyoto Animation's reliable history of outsourcing. Their first series was essentially an introduction to the wider world. And, as the old saying goes, first impressions mean everything. Even if there was a slight expectation that the first time around isn't always the cleanest, it doesn't disincentivize wanting to make the best display possible. Plus, of the bed of options that had been at their disposal, it wasn't as if they were naturally being pulled in one direction as opposed to another. The studio's outsourcing work involved both comedic content and more serious dramatic content. For every Cowboy Bebop episode 20 that they worked on, there was a Turn A Gundam episode 4, and then some. There are other considerations that need to be evaluated as well. Does the studio take a risk and decide to do something that's more original, or do they rely upon something that has an established franchise by adapting the pre-existing material? Honestly, I don't envy the decisions that needed to be made here. So, which options did they choose? Well, let's put a pin in that for now. We'll come back to it in a little bit. There is, of course, another question that needs to be answered, and that is the matter of who was going to direct this new series. Of the major figures at the studio in terms of working on the anime itself, rather than being behind the scenes with planning and producing, Kyoto Animation had 3 people who would be reasonably tasked with heading this new project: Ishihara Tatsuya, Takemoto Yasuhiro, and Kigami Yoshiji. Let's assume for the sake of this exercise that none of them voluntarily stepped up to assume this directorial position, and I cannot find anything to say that one of them did volunteer. All 3 men had worked in anime production for years, and each had demonstrated their own capabilities of being able to lead a production. While Ishihara had not been a full director since Shiawase Nani back in 1991, his episode directing work on several properties throughout that time indicated that he might be ready for the job. Takemoto helped make the 2 episodes of The Soul Taker he episode directed some of the major highlights of that show, and Nurse Witch Komugi's inherently chaotic nature gave reason to the idea that he could be relied upon since he directed the first 2 episodes of that. Kigami was the one who had received the most recent directorial credit on his own creation, Munto, and, while not as overtly expressive as Nurse Witch Komugi on several fronts, showed that he might be trustworthy for something ambitious. That, and his instructional presence, would be a major opportunity for the studio's young blood. However, circumstances ultimately dictated that the 3 options available may not have been as open as one might assume. It's worth pointing out that Kigami had only just recently finished directing and writing Munto, and moving from that into something that might resemble a 12 to 13 episode run of a TV seasonal might be asking too much in such a short time frame. If the studio wanted to release something in 2003, production for that would have been taking place during the time that Munto was both being created and wrapped. As such, Kigami would have been double booked on directorial work. Imagine the sheer stress of trying to finish your own passion project while also being tasked with Kyoto Animation's maiden voyage into TV production. Along with this, Kigami's overall list of credits tend to involve movies or OVAs rather than television. That's not to imply that there are no television credits whatsoever, but rather that, looking at his catalog more closely, the major properties that stand out are things like Akira, several Doraemon movies, Grave of the Fireflies, and several other films. Also notable is that, while there are a couple of episode director credits thrown in, most of his work is as a key animator. Things such as Generator Gall episodes 7 and 11 as episode director are the exceptions rather than the rule. As a result, I cannot exactly blame the studio for choosing to pass on Kigami. I dare say that their decision turned out for the best given Kigami's eventual career at Kyoto Animation, but we'll get into that later on in the series. So, that leaves Ishihara and Takemoto. While there is a little more similarity in regards to distribution of credits, the largest comes in directorial responsibilities both for their prior history and the history that immediately concerned Kyoto Animation. Though Ishihara had more credits in terms of episode directing, Takemoto's recent directorial work on Nurse Witch Komugi meant that he was a more recently christened director, and thus the studio could strike while the iron is hot and ride the momentum of his creative and production success. Plus, Takemoto's credits reflected that not only was he willing to serve as episode director for the things that he was asked or volunteered to do, but he would also do key animation work for those same episodes. This meant that he could simultaneously approach things from the perspective of an animator and a director, assessing the visual language and parts of the process from both angles to create something that fuses the perspectives. Comparatively speaking, Ishihara had almost entirely stepped away from animation of any kind once Umeboshi Denka Uchu Hatte no Panparapan completed its own production. He still often assumed storyboard responsibilities for episodes he directed, which, if you recall from my Anime Staff Explained video in the storyboarding section, was pretty common back then. But storyboarding and animating are not the same thing. It's important, yes, but although this is just speculation, it's possible that the executives at Kyoto Animation felt that someone who combined both an animating mind like Kigami and a directorial mind like Ishihara would be best. So they picked Takemoto to be the director for their first TV anime. Just to make it clear, like I stated with the Curse of the One Piece analysis I did when talking about Ishihara compared to Kigami, I don't want to disparage Ishihara as somehow a lesser figure among Kyoto Animation's ranks. He'll be massively important in the coming years. It's just that we haven't gotten to his stuff yet. Okay, so we have our director. Now what? Well, let's return to that pin for a moment about which approaches to take with making their TV anime. Funnily enough, the answer utilized the same presumed solution that Kyoto Animation did when choosing Takemoto. Take the best of both worlds. Do something that utilizes drama and comedy as part of its texture. Take something pre-existing, but see if there's a way to approach it from a different angle. Essentially, the studio opted to reuse the approach that they took with the Soul Taker to make Nurse Witch Komugi. And hey, we even got the same guy to take up the directorial mantle this time too. Everything has a way of working out in the end, doesn't it? We're obviously not privy to the conversations that took place behind closed doors about the final decision, but when the I's were dotted and the T's crossed, the heads at Kyoto Animation decided to take advantage of a rather popular series to get it done, choosing Full Metal Panic. But before we can talk about what the studio did with it, we need to set up some context first. Full Metal Panic was an anime created at Studio Gonzo, running for 24 episodes from January 2002 until June of that same year. Based on the light novels by Gatou Shouiji and directed by Chigira Koichi, it follows the story of Sagara Sosuke, a sergeant among the ranks of the Mithril Private Military Organization. Along with his fellow officers Kurtz Weber and Melissa Mao, and his captain Talitha Testarossa, or Tessa for short, he is tasked with watching over a seemingly ordinary Japanese high school student named Chidori Kaname. The interest Mithril has in her is because Kaname is what's called a whispered, or a person who has incredibly technologically advanced knowledge locked away in their subconscious. If properly harnessed, that information would be able to stem the tides of global geopolitical and militaristic conflicts. In order to properly protect her by staying close by, Sosuke enrolls at her high school as, well, what could charitably be called one of the worst undercover operations ever. Sosuke's propensity for causing problems through his overzealous defense of Kaname, all without her catching wind of who he actually is more than enough to cause a few headaches. Whether it's inadvertently walking into the girl's changing room, aggressively tackling people, or insisting with ironclad will that he is not in fact following Kaname home from school, Sosuke and Kaname are connected by both mission and circumstance. The foundation of the show rests on the inherently ridiculous juxtaposition between Sosuke's mission and the normalcy of Kaname's high school life that he is thoroughly unable to adjust to. Despite all of Sosuke's screw-ups, Kaname cannot help but find him a rather interesting figure, and in her defense, who could blame her? The dynamic that arises out of this takes on more serious connotations once Kaname ends up being captured by the wicked Gowron, who himself has a rather twisted and revolting history with Sosuke. Therefore, Mithril and Sosuke must go rescue Kaname. The irony that develops is that, now that the cat is out of the bag, it is the very things that Sosuke has done up to this point, and will continue to do under the guise of protecting Kaname, that both frustrates her and makes her gradually fall in love with him. She's aware that Sosuke is in the military, and that Sosuke being this careful and excessive is how he shows that he cares. But because he doesn't show that he cares in a way that is at least a little more normal, it causes her to feel frustration. Yet it's through her frustrations that she realizes that it's the things that frustrate her about him that she also likes about him, and she wants him to like her back. To paraphrase, quote, the Broadway musical Avenue Q for a moment, the more you love someone, the more you want to kill them. Eventually, Sosuke's sworn duty to protect Kaname from harm is itself the very thing that ends up fueling his own eventual affections for her, even though he sometimes can't understand why she's so frustrated by what are, to Sosuke, completely sensible safety precautions. On top of that, there's the affections coming Sosuke's way from Captain Tessa, herself almost a little too eager to get close and spend time with him. Yet, there's a barrier that cannot necessarily be crossed because of the power relationship between captain and subordinate. The enduring sentiment throughout Full Metal Panic's central romantic tether is that of either personal or militaristic stubbornness, with each party member either not being courageous enough to make the leap into saying their feelings outright, being too oblique and not picking up on the signs that the others are sending, or the very structure of the militaristic organization that prevents things from taking whatever course they might in the end. And as if that weren't enough, there's the special Arbalest mech that Sosuke needs to get used to using since no one else can seemingly use it properly. Tessa trying to prove her worth as a captain despite her young age and klutziness, and a seemingly endless parade of odd situations that complicate anything the series might pull are other parts comprising the material. Part of the reason why Full Metal Panic works at all is because in using a preposterous backdrop as the means of carrying out both its romantic comedy and war plots, both are allowed the elbow room to move along in their own unusual manners. It's not exactly the cleanest progression in the world, and the series itself doesn't necessarily stick every landing with panache. It's also not exactly the best looking anime either. It has its good moments, but it's not going to set the world on fire. But the end result is that it's a story with a cast that proves surprisingly endearing and funny, manages to get tension across when it needs to, a romantic dynamic that I found myself delightfully tickled by to the point where it's my favorite part of the show, a surprisingly decent dub in a time when dubs weren't exactly known for their pristine quality yet, though there are of course some exceptions, and is off-kilter enough so that it seems like it always has something at its disposal or up its sleeve. For being something that pulls at as many threads as it does, it's kind of incredible that it doesn't all come undone. I personally don't feel that the original Full Metal Panic is a masterpiece, but it endured for a reason, with Kaname particularly being one of the quintessential tsunderes of the early 2000s. So, with all that context out of the way, it helps set the stage for what Kyoto Animation saw in the franchise with its subsequent Gonzo adaptation that made them choose it as their baseline. With Takemoto's handling of both comedy and drama, eye for animation, and the overall material greenlit for them that affords a sandbox of possibilities to utilize, all that was left was deciding on comedy versus drama. Nurse Witch Komugi meant that Takemoto had shown comfortability with comedic work, and Kigami's Munto was decidedly not intended as a comedic piece given its apocalyptic and thematic overhang. Therefore, the central idea was comedy, and do it full speed ahead to make the biggest splash possible. And thankfully, the Full Metal Panic franchise had a solution ready and waiting. While there were at the time 5 light novels in the course of the main franchise, Gatou Shouiji also created a series of more comedy-oriented side novels that offered digressions away from the main war and mecha-focused plot. Using these as the structure to build the anime around, the final product was Full Metal Panic Fumoffu, debuting in August 2003 and finishing its airing in October of that same year. Hold on to your hats, everyone. It's going to get a little explosive.
Yeah, it had some spectacular explosions. Kaboom!
The most recent conflict with Gowron and his forces has come to an end, and thus an era of calm has come to Jindai High School with Kaname, as well as Mithril's operations in protecting her. Everything is back to the way it was before. At least in a manner of speaking. That's certainly the case with Sosuke still being obsessed with taking militaristic stances and reactions to most things. So, in a certain sense, life goes on. And it's not as though Sosuke's own attention to detail is not going to matter in the coming days, as he and Kaname eventually become members of the student council. If there's one thing that we've learned from watching many anime, it's that a student council wields an uncanny amount of power and influence over the larger student body and what transpires during the course of the school year. What could daily school life look like when you have a militaristic sergeant obsessed with traps, firearms, and safety heading the security, and a headstrong blue-haired girl with a giant paper fan as a weapon functioning as the vice president? It seems like, wherever or whatever is causing it, there's another battle to be fought somewhere over something. And hey, who's to say that it should be confined within their school, either? If the original Full Metal Panic sought to situate Sosuke and Kaname within the larger conflict with Mithril and the Whispered, Full Metal Panic Fumoffu cares more about situating the two within what could pass as the humdrum. Sort of. We'll get to that. But even ignoring Sosuke's presence, there is little that could be said to pass for normal at Jindai High School itself. First, after the events of the original Full Metal Panic and the hostage incident with the class's plane, Sosuke's presence and antics have become more tolerated to an extent by his classmates. All of the odd impressions that he left in his introduction and behavior have been internalized as simply being a part of how he is as a person. Naturally, this acceptance doesn't mean much to Kaname, who still finds herself trying to talk or smack some sense into Sosuke to be more normal. But their new positions on the student council bring their own degrees of acceptance for Sosuke's way of being. The student council's president, Hayashimizu Atsunobu, not only seems perfectly content to let Sosuke's overzealous protections and mannerisms move completely undisturbed and unfettered, but he likewise never seems to break this unflappable concentration of either coming up with solutions or justifying Sosuke's actions. Then there's the secretary, Mikihara Ren, whose unflinchingly Yamato Nadeshiko persona is equally unflappable. At Atsunobu's side seemingly everywhere he goes, you'd never guess that she was a family member of Yakuza. Indeed, humdrum could hardly be considered an appropriate word for Full Metal Panic Fumoffu. Any veil of the ordinary is purely that, a veil, barely concealing the crazy madness that lies underneath. There is no shortage of odd circumstances that dictate school life, as it seems that there is always some new problem or situation that seeks to make that so-called everyday school life more aggravating than it needs to be. Sometimes, in typical Sosuke fashion, he's often at the center of what's going on, usually cosmically misunderstanding the level of direction that he needs to follow. Even after all this time and the student body in general being rather plain, he still doesn't realize that someone opening his locker door is not an excuse for rigging the entire thing to blow up because he thinks someone set a booby trap in there. And during all of that, he must balance this absurd vigilance with being a good student. Though this does mean that he might accidentally forget Kaname's notebook at his apartment. But despite the seeming plainness of the student body, there are more than a few odd duck characters that make their presence known this time around. Mixed in with Sosuke causing problems are things that happen to Sosuke, Kaname, their friends, and the school, rather than Sosuke being the direct cause. When someone seems to be sneaking around messing with the female students after hours, or a bread stand sees an uncompromisingly crazed teacher make every effort possible to sink the endeavor, Sosuke doesn't seem nearly so strange. And that's to say nothing of the school's rugby team, at one time so dominant and now complete wallflowers who seem to protest any sort of violence while participating in a violent sport. Thus, Full Metal Panic Fumoffu's ultimate orientation is in how it takes a particular situation and manages to extract the most crazed and bizarre realization of what it contains. It wastes no chance to completely fly off the hinges or come careening down the mineshaft with no brakes. Take the rugby team, for instance. A team that has such a long losing streak is certainly not in and of itself that unusual, but throw in their mannerisms, such to the point where Kaname herself cannot believe that this is what they're like, along with Sosuke putting them through army-style regiment training a la Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, and you have yourself a well-oiled death machine, eager to annihilate anyone who dares to oppose them. For so much of the franchise, Sosuke's propensity for militaristic solutions tends to be an aggravation as opposed to being a workable solution. Here, though, the narrative makes it so that Sosuke's approach is perfectly suited to the matter at hand. Plus, he has the student council president's seemingly unending support for such actions. Given how much of his work up to this point has been protecting Kaname, and often in times where his overzealousness wasn't warranted, the anime presents several opportunities in which it does work out after all. Though there may still be times where resolutions lead to Sosuke getting the blunt end of Kaname's paper fan, or some other kind of comeuppance, Full Metal Panic Fumoffu provides a space for Sosuke to do what he does without such a serious overhang. In truth, it kinda rewards him for his attention to detail, paranoia at seeing various contingencies, and makes what he does its own brand of quirkily admirable. As extreme as it might be, Sosuke does indeed have a method to his madness. How else to explain the pure and unqualified success of dressing up like an amusement park mascot multiple times throughout the series to achieve some desired outcome or realization? Of course, this doesn't take into consideration all the moments that his misinterpretation of basic concepts, or his excessiveness, does lead to more problems. That much of the status quo has certainly not changed. Only Sosuke could find a way to take an artistic project and run away with the teacher's philosophical ranting by, well, literally running away into the forest to try and become the perfect model. As the old saying goes at the end of the film Some Like It Hot, nobody's perfect. But naturally, running through so much of Full Metal Panic Fumoffu is the continued budding relationship between Sosuke and Kaname, and the fact that they now work together on the student council presents plenty of opportunities for them to get closer. But even that can't be allowed to just progress in any kind of normal manner, can it? Aside from Kaname and Sosuke's characters simply not allowing that kind of budging so quickly, something else just has to get thrown in. As such, it should come as no surprise that Tessa manages to get some needed R&R and decides to spend all of it at Jindai High School and living with Sosuke. It's not difficult to see the sheer problem that her presence brings, not helped by Sosuke's commander threatening to kill him if there's any kind of foul play on Sosuke's part. Unlike Kaname, Tessa isn't the kind of girl who waits around waiting for the guy to make the first move, doing everything in her power to get closer to Sosuke, even if it means possibly violating his personal space. With Kaname's fiery demeanor being what it is, poor Sosuke is caught in a crossfire that the military never could have properly prepared him for. Perhaps under these circumstances, fighting Galron was a welcome relief. All of this is to say that Kyoto Animation clearly understood the assignment. I mentioned before that the option of a comedic full speed ahead was intended, and just like with Nurse Witch Komugi, things sometimes need to go the silliest and stupidest route possible in order to take full advantage of itself. Takemoto's mastery of the comedic meant that the studio took the lessons learned from the OVA's construction and maximized it in an entirely new setting. When the source material provides something that the studio can grasp, they can make magic with it. Despite Full Metal Panic Fumoffu being the first TV anime released by the studio, they were not yet at the point where they could handle the production in-house fully. A look at the credits for the show indicates that a familiar face shows itself under the Production Cooperation credits, a label normally given to studios or companies that heavily involved outsourcing. Tatsunoko Productions, the same studio that helped give Kyoto Animation some of their biggest outsourcing work in the 80s and with The Soul Taker in 2001, appears in the credits for episodes 4, 5, 10, and 11. Likewise, they appear in several other credits within those same episodes to more cleanly delineate how they helped, including finishing/shiage and in-between/dolga. It's worth pointing out that, in comparison to what the in-house episodes did, the Tatsunoko outsourced episodes are the weakest episodes of the series. It's not because they're poor or incompetently made. Far from it, they're still pretty fun ventures. Rather, it just establishes that the level of excellence Kyoto Animation could already achieve with this TV project was so high that nearly everything else seems quaint by comparison. Complicating this a little further is because of the philosophy that was taken with the series and how it would be handled production-wise. The final product shows that the studio apparently wanted to deliver every kind of comedic sensibility that they could reasonably get their hands on, from slapstick to gradually building jokes, from mundane settings to preposterously ridiculous solutions, and from warped perspective and compositing to Austin Powers-style censorship. Because the net was so widely cast, Kyoto Animation could not afford to fit it all into a single stylistic box. Each episode of the series thus was geared around its own particular comedic identity, something that was determined not only by what the episode itself demanded, but also as a result of what each individual episode director sought to accomplish, and how they went about doing so. If you recall back in the Anime Staff Explained video, I mentioned that the two general approaches that directors take with episode directors either are adhering to the director's vision as closely as possible, or allowing each episode director the chance to go crazy and flex their creative muscles. Full Metal Panic Fumoffu therefore sets an early example that, even though there might potentially be numerous people working on episodes, Kyoto Animation was not averse to the notion of greenlighting projects that allow for these creative explosions from its figures. Taking the first 3 episodes in a vacuum for a moment, each one not only has a different overall comedic structure, but also a different means of achieving that stylistically. Because of this, they feel self-contained both as stories in their own right, and as aesthetic pieces that still nevertheless fit within the threads of Full Metal Panic Fumoffu as a whole. For episode 1, Kitanohara Noriyuki had been, as he continues to be now, one of the absolute stalwarts of Kyoto Animation's forces. Though he has never actually had a full directing job to his name at the time of this script, his animation and episode directing credits are numerous, heavily involved in nearly everything the studio did. His visual language for this specific episode relies often on odd perspectives, light filters, and excellent pillow shots for the purposes of conveying mood and tension. The saturation in the compositing works quite well in providing some choking tension that feels both foreboding and cartoonishly stupid. When Sosuke overloads the gang goons with his uncannily precise takedowns of their personal lives, it manages to pay off for an effective finale to the outing. Kitanohara early on showed a mastery for lighting and mundanity, which manifests more overtly in his later work. The first episode Kigami directed for the show, episode 3, isn't quite as exaggerative as Kitanohara's episode. There are fewer overall gags and instead really messes with the visual of putting characters within large spaces or set pieces. It's tough to not recognize just how small and out of her element Kaname is when she's taken to the giant beach mansion atop the even more giant cliff. Especially given her comparatively muted reactions to Sosuke's tendencies, both in physical act and cutting remarks, the episode has an interesting incorporation of physical and metaphorical distance. Despite the muted tone, it's not a humorless affair. There are some hilarious plot twists in the character dynamics, particularly with the boy who seems rather smitten with Kaname and just what he's willing to do to ensure her safety. In that sense, what transpires is perfectly at home within Full Metal Panic. At the same time, the end of the episode honors the romantic undercurrent of Kaname and Sosuke by having a genuinely sweet scene of them riding off on an inflated balloon, a scenario itself forcing them to be physically close, and both sincerely happy for it. It's a rapid resolution to the story, but one that manages to get the job done so effectively that I cannot help but feel a little sentimental watching it. And as is par for the course, it's just funny. Now for episode 2, that brings up a certain person who I have to introduce now because he's very important for future installments of the series and Kyoto Animation in general. In the Munto video, I alluded to someone that I didn't name because while they were relevant to Kyoto Animation forming their own limited company, Animation Dole, he wasn't relevant to talking about Munto itself. And as you can tell by the tone of my voice, I certainly have some feelings about him. But we'll leave that for another time when it's more significant, and I'll just introduce him properly now. Episode 2 was directed by Yamamoto Yutaka, better known in the industry as Yamakan. One of Kigami Yoshiji's primary proteges, Episode 2 is a near-perfect display of comedic muscle operating with reckless abandon, and somehow still working in sweetness to boot. It's only arguably one-upped by Yamakan's own Episode 9, which features not only one of the best open-air bath fanservice plots in anime, but is just as much of a visual acoustic comedic mastery as Episode 2. Sosuke's furious ping-pong skills, the running animation, and that Austin Powers censorship that I mentioned earlier in the video showed that Yamakan understood humor and slapstick timing so perfectly that it's genuinely incredible, which is all the more depressingly hysterical when we get to looking at him later in this run. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. We'll get there, I promise. Whether it be episodes by Kitanohara, Yamakan, or Kigami, or even Ishihara with the first of the 2 episodes to heavily feature Tessa, the level of technical competence on display makes it clear that even within the rigor of a 12-episode series, there's little cause for concern as to whether they could handle it. Consistently excellent drawings and flourishes of animation give the series its vitality that would pay other dividends in later comedically inclined series like Lucky Star, Nichijou, and others. And these flourishes would also manifest in non-comedic moments too. Displays of prowess such as, just to list one general type of example, camera swoops, rotations, and panning in the OP reads as foreshadowing for some of the moments that would really prove either elegant or dramatically effective. I think of the gorgeous shots from the Canon 2006 OP sequence, the opening shot into the city for City the Animation, meeting Chitanda for the first time in Hyoka, and the running sequence on the water from Violet Evergarden. As I said in the video I made about Munto, if Munto could be said to synthesize all the properties that characterize Kyoto Animation from the outsourcing era, Full Metal Panic Fumoffu showed that those properties could be just as strong, if not arguably even stronger, when given an even fuller production treatment. One last aspect of the series that's worth commenting on before closing relates to why Full Metal Panic was picked in the first place. I mentioned before that it was likely within the planning for which franchise to choose that Kyoto Animation would opt for something popular. Given the sheer popularity of some of the studio's later work, it's worth reminding that a lot of the studio's work throughout the course of the 2000s was adaptation of popular work. In saying that, though, I don't want to make it seem like the work of the studio is lesser or less artistically significant compared to what they would make on down the line. Popular is a word that has, depending on the conversation, become loaded with negative connotation or insinuation, a thing that I've talked about on this channel before when I had a vastly worse microphone. But much like Sunrise with Mobile Suit Gundam or MAPPA with its absorption of so many shonen recently, every studio, on some level, relies on popularity in order to make ends meet. For Kyoto Animation starting afresh in the realms of TV anime, it was probably the smartest decision to capitalize on recency and popularity to not only get the most viewers to look their way, but also for the purposes of their financial security if they wanted to expand into new territory. The Soul Taker certainly wasn't a very popular choice among anime fans when they made Nurse Witch Komugi, and Munto wasn't exactly known for being an anime that raked in the dollars. Perhaps it's because we live in an age where we're used to the idea of popular ideas being beaten into the ground and long outlive their usefulness, but the ultimate point is that I don't blame Kyoto Animation, nor penalize Fullmetal Panic Fumoffu, or any other anime for that matter, because of its popular origins. And besides, based on the complete canon of the studio, one could actually argue that the period of mid to late 2000s was their best work. In that spirit of seizing upon popular trends as we move further into the 2000s, now that Kyoto Animation had their first taste of a comedic TV anime, it was time to move into some more dramatic waters. Remember that question near the start of the video about the decision to adapt something comedic or dramatic? Well, after experiencing one, it was perhaps only natural that they'd want to experience the other. They'd get the chance to do so by seizing upon a different trend that had managed to catch fire in the otaku landscape over the past few years. And while they were at it, why not start assembling the building blocks into what would become part of their defining aesthetic sensibility for the rest of the decade? While the studio would not be completely done with the Fullmetal Panic franchise just yet, and would also mine some dramatic gems with it later on, it was time to put it on ice for a few years. Next time, the studio's aesthetic muscle is pushed in a new direction by entering the world of visual novel adaptations, as we take a look at the first of the so-called Holy Trinity with the first Maeda Jun adaptation, Air. A special thank you to my patrons, and a thank you for watching. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, click the bell for notifications so you don't miss an upload, donate to my Patreon, or follow my social media accounts. Links provided in the video's description. In the meantime, this has been ZNote of ZNoteTaku. Happy viewing, everyone!